All right. So we left off, we were just talking about how in France, their style, one of their major contributions is called the Gothic style. Gothic is another one of those terms that was used to be derogatory, but nevertheless it sticks and eventually sort of propels us into those beautiful style of cathedrals that we know today. Still based off the Roman Basilica plan, and so I put that image that we've already seen before on the right. And if you did watch the Byzantine Empire or the Hagia Sophia, Istanbul's mystery movies on Canopy listed earlier for the Byzantine Empire, you'll know that there's the central plan church, which is like the Hagia Sophia, and then the Basilica plan church, which has that sort of cross-like roof structure. Both of these are sort of being added to, but it's the Basilica style that France already has from when Rome left, and so they have several of these. And what they're going to do is try and make something that has more light, that has more tendencies for decoration, higher roofs, and all of that. And so here's what eventually sort of gets taken. So if we went back and looked at, they remove the atrium, but they keep the transepts, the clerestory, and all that becomes one wall on the side. And so we have this classic cross structure right in the middle where the crossing is, would be the altar there, and then sort of the choir behind it instead of those beautiful apse. And so what happens really is that what we have is sort of this French abbot, and he's sort of like designing and sort of coming up with some of these ideas where they want to get more light, they want to get higher ceilings, and they want to have sort of the harmony and the proportions. They also want a structure that sort of says, hey, look at our God. When you walk in here, you can't help but to be awed by like our ability that this structure is holding up. So we must be in favor with God if something like this exists. So that's sort of the image of it, the propaganda behind it. So check out the YouTube link. They go into great detail. But if you look at these two spires that are on the sides over here, right, we can easily tell the two different styles. And from that, you can tell that this is sort of the sample piece, right? This is where they're still sort of figuring it out. The spires themselves are actually built at different times, but still we have sort of a high Gothic and lower Gothic or early Gothic styles. And but we do see that signature rosette window happening here, and sort of those two spires on the side. In the back here, you're starting to see flying buttresses, and we're going to talk about all that sort of stuff. And all those are synonymous features of the Gothic style. And if you think of the Cathedral of Notre Dame that burned here just a year or so ago, is pretty synonymous with that Gothic style, and we can think of sort of those same images in our head. Here's a closer look at that, what's going on. We have in the door jamb these iconic carvings of saints, sometimes even the patrons, figures throughout the Bible. Sometimes you'll even see up here sort of the angels, sort of like again and again, sort of like sort of welcoming the viewer in, but kind of also looking down, sort of like, you better get in there sort of eyes. It's really interesting. If you've ever gone into some of these older European Gothic style cathedrals, there's some sort of like condemnation about them too as they look down at you. But you also have a rose window. This is very, very symbolic of that feature, and that's supposed to let in sort of the light, the divine light, as it shines through. These churches, of course, are going to get a lot of decoration and stuff, and with those decorations, it allows artists to receive patronage. That patronage, of course, sort of fuels art movements. And as we get into Italy, right, the some of those patrons and their work begin to sort of challenge the norm and the style that's been before. So even when you look at this, we have Giotto's Lamentation. This is one panel of several, and you can watch the YouTube link about all of it. And he's using those same Christian icons that we know of. We see the haloing going on, right, a typical scene of one of the stages of the cross where Jesus is being taken from the cross and taken down from that. But what he does is now he's starting to add in more value into the subject matters. They have more gestures, right? They start to have emotion in their faces. And what seemingly still sort of cartoony to us at the time would have been a major shift in art. So this is well before the Renaissance even gets started. But if it wasn't for Giotto, we would not have the Renaissance. And another one of his sort of pieces, how he starts to play with perspective. Perspective is going to be a new element that we're going to explore, but it's breaking with those Byzantine traditions. If you can remember some of those earlier mosaics, especially if you watch the Hagia Sophia film, and you can see that sort of like flattening of space, flattening of the image. And once again, we're not dealing so much with portraiture as a stylization. So he's starting to break with those traditions and add in foreshortening, and also experiment in his own way. All right, so let's go ahead and just get into it. Now, this is really going to cover a lot of art that you probably have known or heard most of these names before. So there's going to be more films. I really implore you just to sort of explore those films. I want to give you a brief over in this, but the films themselves I put there for a reason and are really good resources. So the Renaissance really starts off right around the 1400s. It means rebirth. It's allowing us to sort of reassess as a human culture what it is that we've been redoing. And with that, we see a lot of patronage by specifically the Medici family in Italy. And this family are wealthy merchants and bankers, primarily out of Florence. And what they do is they're able to sort of assemble and pay many artists to do these sort of great works, but let them also push themselves in the tradition to make the human body as perfect as possible. There's this term called humanism that's the center of the Renaissance, and that's the idea that man should find perfection in what he does, right? To really push themselves to be perfect. There's this idea that if God created man and in his image, then man must be sort of the perfect, and so therefore doing images of not only man, but of the nude must be the highest form of art. And we're now shifting out of just craftspeople and sort of guilds into very specific artists, where we'll even start to see artwork being signed for the first time and stuff like that. So there's a lot of stuff on the Renaissance, and so we're just going to jump into this. Perspective is probably the biggest contribution to the Renaissance that's new. And Masaccio is one of the first artists, and he's working with another artist named Brunelleschi to create this stuff. And the diagram there shows how he's using linear perspective, where we have one point that all lines are then receding to. And the YouTube link also goes into greater detail about this. But what we have is sort of this altar piece where if we walked up to this fresco, we would see it's about eye level to us, so it's made to proper human proportion, and below we have this, here is death, right, sort of reference, right? We have the skeleton, and it even has that saying that you remember you will die, this memento mori. And then from there we sort of have this sort of a line shooting upward, right, and this looking up and seeing sort of that idea of salvation. And we have God, the dove, and then the Jesus, they're crucified, sort of the Holy Spirit, God, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus, that Holy Trinity being represented there. But you would stand at this thing, and it's made from our perspective, so when you looked up, you felt like you were looking up into a ceiling. And look at the link, it's quite beautiful. Of course, one of the earliest and what's considered the Renaissance man is Leonardo. Leonardo is a very interesting character in art history, as he's actually known as the master of procrastination, and most of his works are not even finished. He took so many commissions, and he would start things and then, kind of like a squirrel, get distracted by something shinier and move on. He kind of did things his own way, and and there's all that mythology about Leonardo that you probably have heard of, and most of it in some instances true. We're not going to look at the Mona Lisa since we already looked at that in in the early chapters 1 to 3. But here's sort of another representation that we have of Leonardo, and he develops a technique called sfumato, and it means smoke. And so if you look, there, like the edges of everything just seem to sort of like fade away, and then the other object begins. It's not like we have a hard edge. And this style is very synonymous with him, and what makes him so sort of like new and popular. But he's definitely probably more of a scientist than an artist. He's very just curious. And so that curiosity, that endless curiosity, sort of is pushing him and pushing the boundaries of what he could do in paint. The other, of course, is Michelangelo. There's a lot about him and many works that you could cover. We're just going to do a few. He's actually kind of the scumbag of the art Renaissance man. He was a really sort of tempered, violent man. He was always ridiculing other artists. He would actually taunt Leonardo. Leonardo's a little bit older by the time Michelangelo is sort of in his prime, and he would just follow the old man around, sort of taunting him and stuff. So he's not really the nicest figure in art history, but he is definitely one that produces what many would regard as, the best artwork. He's considered probably the most talented genius of art, but anyway, in their own way. But his Sistine Chapel, right, is another sort of masterpiece. This wall, the west wall, actually, he doesn't finish till way later. It's these up here that he starts with, and he's actually told to do it by the Pope at the time, and he actually tries to refuse it, but because he says he's not a painter, he's a sculptor. But when the Pope tells you to do something, you do it, because these are more popes that are like emperor popes. They're not what we think of today as sort of the Pope figure. These are sometimes like military even leaders too. Like they're in charge of a lot of things that are not just religious based. What's also going on too is the Renaissance in the north, right? So that's Germany and France, Netherlands, and that area. And they're sort of passing ideas back and forth. So what's going on in the north, then you have artists going down and traveling into Italy and taking those ideas, bringing them back into the north, and then back and forth these ideas go. And so you'll see what's mostly different, though, is that in the north, they're very interested in altar pieces, right? So this is a triptych where you'd have folding panels on the side, and they would fold in, and on the back side would be other scenes that are painted. And these altar pieces are, of course, commissioned for the churches, and are usually of the life of Jesus. But this one's kind of interesting because it's actually commissioned for a hospital for those inflicted with skin disease. And if you research this piece even more, you'll find that Jesus is just mutilated, he's broken, he's twisted, which is very much unlike any other depiction of Jesus that we have at the time on the cross. And so the mutilation is evident there, and you can imagine, like, when you look at really closely at this piece, and if you look at the videos that I've posted on your Moodle shell, you'll find that there's splinters and stuff in his flesh. There's what seems to be open wounds, and if you can imagine being someone in this hospital and you walk up to this to pray, you can see like, oh wow, this man suffered too. Right, there's kind of like this, oh, he would understand what I'm going through, or know that maybe you don't even have it as bad as in this case Jesus had. So so there's sort of this confliction that's going on with the piece, but really sort of amazing work, monumental in scale, and is very synonymous with the Northern Renaissance. Also, works that they really enjoyed show memento mori, which means you must remember that you will die. And click the link on here, it'll be the easiest thing to do. But if you look at this, if you stand on the right side or turn your computer screens and look at this thing, what you notice here in the middle, which seems to be sort of this abstract shape, is actually a human skull done at a weird angle. And I would just sort of implore you to think about, why is it, if you could paint this well, why would you put such an abstraction in there? And to me, that's what makes this piece so fascinating, is that now you're having artists even showing this, like, they're going to take their own sort of liberties when creating. So watch the YouTube link. It'll give a lot of information, and we'll follow this up soon with another video.